Action! Welcome to our very first episode of the Sewing Junkie Lab, and I am your host today, the solution scientist, Boki, and today's episode, we're going to be talking about stitch lengths. I feel like this is a really underrated topic, and there's so many different opinions surrounding it, so I'm going to give you some basic knowledge today about stitch lengths and when to use those, so that way you can decide what fits your projects the best. I'm here with Gigi's Fabric Shop, home to Juki and Junkies, and in today's video, well, this is our first video of a new series that I'm really excited to start. I kind of like hinted it in an older video about how I wanted to do something like this, so I came up with the idea and I said, let's just do it. So me and David ordered ourselves some lab coats because we are your solution scientists, so be excited for this series because we're going to go over a lot of the scientific things in sewing and just break it down a little further, give you those really nice visuals that scientists do. They'll, explain something to you, and sometimes you just need to like visually see it in a different way for it to make sense. So I want to start off this series with stitch length, so I think that's going to be really good. So by the end of this video, you're going to understand what is stitch length, what it does, how it works, and it's just going to be really fun. So let's get started. All right, so let's start off by understanding what even is a stitch length. What does that mean? What does it do? And where is it on my machine? So on every machine, it's going to vary, obviously, a little bit. For today's episode, I'm on the Juki TL-18 QVP, and my stitch length, you really can't miss it. It's this giant big dial right here that moves left and right, so I can change it accordingly. And it goes from 0 to 6, 0 being my smallest stitch length and 6 being my longest stitch length. This will vary from machine to machine, obviously, and it's going to be somewhere different on your machine. So always refer to your user manual to understand where things are on your sewing machines as you're getting used to them. Stitch length is just how long you want those stitches to be, and depending on what machine you have, you might also have stitch width. Stitch width is how wide you want those stitches to be, so nothing to do with the length, but the width. This machine is just a straight stitch only machine, so I don't have any control over adjusting my stitch width because it only goes forward and backwards. So the only thing that matters is going forward and backwards, how long I want those stitches to be. So let's start off with the first one being 0. When do I use a stitch length of 0? So a stitch length of 0 means that there is no stitch length. It means that it's going to sew just in place. And when would you want something like that? Well, a perfect example would be in free motion quilting. In free motion quilting, you're going to actually drop your feed dogs down. You're going to put your stitch length at 0. And what that's going to do is the machine is, well, basically the needle is just moving up and down. So what that means is you are now in control of your stitch length. So 0 really means endless possibilities because you are controlling how long you want that stitch length to be. So if you're somebody who does free motion embroidery, or if you do free motion quilting, anything where you are in charge of moving the fabric around, the solution is going to be stitch length of 0, and you have to make sure you drop your feed dogs down. Especially when you are doing a free motion quilting style, there's never going to be a stitch length because you're always going to put the feed dogs down. This speaks directly to the feed dogs. The feed dogs are what's helping grab that fabric and feed it through the machine. So if you're putting it at 6, it's going to take bigger strides on that fabric so that way it pushes it through and gets you a stitch length of 6. Also works with the needle naturally. They all kind of come together to make that stitch length. But if you're putting your feed dogs down, this is not even going to matter because the feed dogs are out of the way and they're not serving any purpose by touching the fabric. So 0 is purely for when you're doing free motion quilting, free motion embroidery, where you're in charge of regulating your speed, and the speed plays hand in hand with how big and how long you want those stitches to look. The next stitch length that we're going to talk about is really anything between 0 and 1. That's going to be a very, very tight stitch length, almost where it looks like you grab a pencil and you draw a line. Like there's not going to be any really pronounced definition in between the stitches. I had a really hard time understanding when somebody would ever want to use a stitch length that tiny, but upon my research, I found that a 1 could be used for doing like repairs or if you're preventing frays. It's more of like a stability stitch too. It's just hard because when you're doing something that incredibly tight, it can also kind of defeat the purpose and really spread like the weave of the fabric, or if you're working with a synthetic fabric, it's kind of just hole punching it. So if someone can come up with a better explanation for why you would ever use a 0 to a 1, that's what I found in my research. But the moral of the story is this is going to be a very, very tight stitch length, like incredibly, incredibly tight. Now talking from stitch length 1 to 2, there's a lot of possibility in there. 1.5 I found to be a very great stitch length for paper piecing. And the reason that is because when you paper piece, you actually are sewing on a piece of paper. It's like a little printed thin paper that has all your numbers and you're constructing your pieces according to it. It's like sewing origami. It's really cool. So you put that down and you're actually sewing paper on the machine. So 1.5 is nice because it's a very tight stitch length. It also helps you be able to tear off the paper very easily. So you don't want to use too long of a stitch length when you're doing paper piecing because it can be harder to perforate that paper, but you also don't want to use something super, super light because then all the little fibers of the paper get stuck in the seams. So it's nice to use something like a 1.5 to just kind of perforate it right off when you have your block or whatever you're putting together all assembled. So that's what 1.5 is for. Now getting a little bit into closer to 2, something like 1.8 to 2.5. This is what I would consider a piecing stitch length. So this is a construction stitch length, all right? And I'm gonna go over the difference between a decorative type of stitch length and a construction type of stitch length because there is a very big difference, okay? So when you are piecing your quilts or your bags or whatever project you're assembling and putting together, that is gonna be your construction stitch. It's like the make it or break it. It's the foundation of the whole project itself. It's like the building, right? It's the foundation, the bones of the project. So you want to make sure you're using the appropriate stitch length, something nice and tight, because if you use something too big, it's going to fall apart over the course of time. The weight of the bag or the weight of the project is not going to be bared down very well, especially in quilts too. Like if you're using too long of a stitch length, you'll notice those little seams start to pop open. Over the course of time as you're washing it, it could come undone. So I like to personally, this is my personal preference, I like to go right under 2, like almost like a 1.8. Think of like right under it. And I like to use that for when I'm piecing my quilts and my bags because I'm working with Glide 40 weight thread. Glide 40 is a 40 weight polyester thread. So this thread is a little bit thicker than standard cotton. So I want the stitch length to be a little bit tighter because since it's polyester, it tends to unravel a little bit easier. It's a lot slicker, it's smoother. That's why it runs so beautifully through the machine. So I like to use 1.8 when I'm doing my piecing to make sure my seams stay nice and tight. I've had customers reach out to me and say, I don't know what it is, but the beginning and the ends of my seams, the fabric starts to come undone. And I always tell them, make sure you tighten up those stitches a little bit. Now, if you're somebody who likes to work with cotton, you could increase that a little bit, maybe to like 2, 2.3, you know, to your liking. But anything really past a 2.5 is gonna be too large and you kind of start posing that threat of those stitches coming undone. So keep that in mind. I know the tighter the stitch, it also becomes hard to seam rip those stitches out, but we don't think about that. You wanna think about the longevity of your project. We're not piecing to take them out, right? Don't even think about the seam ripper. Think about the longevity of the project. So keep that in mind, all right? So back to my whole construction versus decorative. That is very important to know. So what is a decorative stitch? What would that mean? So decorative stitches really do mean what they say. They're those visible stitches you see on your clothing, on your bag, on your straps. They're that beautiful finished stitch, especially in a quilt. The top stitching that you see in the quilting finish, those are beautiful pronounced stitches. They're not solid lines. They shouldn't be solid lines. You want them to be nice and pronounced, as we like to call them, those dinosaur humps, where like the stitches are individually pronounced and they add that extra pizzazz. Kind of like when you buy a new car and you go inside and the stitches on the seats are just delicious. They're inspiring. They're beautiful. It's like, how can I get my stitches to look like that? That is a decorative stitch. So that stitch doesn't necessarily always hold a very big construction point into the project where it's not like the bare bones. It's the finishing touches on the building, right? It's the decorative look. It's the nice finish, the nice trim on a building. So keep that in mind. Obviously that does vary from project to project. Like in a quilt, for example, when you're quilting, you kind of want to use something like a 3.5 to a 4. So anywhere from 3.5 to a 4 is a perfect stitch length for doing quilting. It's going to be beautiful. It's nice and decorative. Honestly, 3.5 to 4 is a great place for top stitching in general. There's other things that come into play with stitch length too, like how thick your thread is. So if you're working with a very thick thread, like an industrial style thread, let's say, you might want to make those stitches a little bit longer because it's such a thick thread that you want to give it some space to actually be able to pronounce itself and show off those beautiful dinosaur humps that you're looking for. So in bags, your top stitch might have to be a little bit longer. It might have to be, you know, between 4, 4.5 even, maybe even a little bit closer to 5, just depending on the thickness of that thread. So the best way to understand this is honestly get on your sewing machine and just sew out a bunch of different stitch lengths. Understand which one you like the best. What does it serve? How does it look? How do they compare? You should be able to see those differences as you change it. So for quilting, anywhere from 3.5 to 4 is going to be perfect for nice and beautiful defined stitches on your project. And that's more decorative for sure. The next one that I want to talk about is top stitching on bags. Top stitching on bags looks a little different. In bags, a lot we find ourselves working with synthetic materials like cork, canvas, vinyl, faux leather, things that once the hole is there, it's there forever, right? So having a good stitch length is really important here, and this varies. So with synthetic materials, once the hole is there, it's there. So if you're building the bottom of a bag, especially like the corners of a bag or the part where the strap connects to the bag, those are weight-bearing parts of the bag. So like when you put the bag on your shoulder and all of that weight is dropped down, you don't want to use a super tight stitch length to attach those straps to the bag. And why is that? I'm going to give you an analogy. So think of a movie ticket. When you have a movie ticket or anything that you kind of rip off, right, there's all those little perforated lines. Consider that like your vinyl or leather bag, right? So if your stitches are really tight, what's going to happen is that's going to happen, right? You don't want those stitches to be incredibly close where it just kind of snaps off. You're going to do that perforated style where over the course of time, things are just going to rip off. So depending on the portions of your projects, but keep that in mind, when you're doing those weight-bearing parts on your bag, you don't want to use a super tight stitch length because you're just going to kind of ruin it and it's just going to rip right off your arms. So keep that in mind. But for top stitching on vinyl and things like that, you're going to have like a more structure there, more stability, lots of layers that you're going to be sewing through when you're creating bags. So using a nice, beautiful top stitch, something like a 4 is going to be really nice for bags. But again, just depends. If you're working with a Glide 40, 3.5 to 4 is going to be beautiful. But if you're working with like Tex 60 or Tex 45, maybe you want to make those stitches a little bit longer so that way that thick thread kind of speaks for itself and is a little bit more defined. The next set of stitches that I want to talk about is going to be stitch length 5 and 6. That is a really long stitch length, okay? So what I consider 5 and 6 and even bigger than that is going to be more of a basting stitch. Basting stitches mean that, let's say you are putting a bag together, right? And you have all the layers piled up and you have like that pocket of the zipper, you have the lining and you have all the interfacing and the edges are kind of loose, right? What you could do to make it come together a little bit easier is to baste around and just catch the edges of that project. So if your seam allowance is 1/4 inch, or let's say it's 1/2 inch, right? Because that's common in bags. You're sewing all the way around at 1/2 inch for construction. But if you want to baste things together and kind of keep it a little bit all tight and fastened so that way nothing shifts before you actually put it together, baste all the way around at 1/4 inch. Why? The stitches are going to be really long. It's going to reduce your bulk. You can also rip those stitches out afterwards when you've finally constructed it all together. You baste at 1/4, you piece at 1/2, that's hidden out of the way, and you can always take it out because it's really nice and long, so you can baste it right out, so that way there's minimal bulk in your seams. So basting is really nice. I use basting a lot, especially in bag making, and if you're a fellow bag maker, you'll understand that. And if you haven't tried it before, do it. It's very nice. If the pattern doesn't tell you to do it, think about that as a great way to just make it a little bit easier for you so things don't shift around. But you can use it in quilting too. You could totally do that to any of your edges. Basting is great just to keep things in place. And it's nice because the stitches are long and you can rip them right out. Anything past a 6, so depending on your sewing machine, is going to be incredibly long. A great example that I thought of for a really long stitch length is when you use 6, you could do gathering stitches. Gathering stitches are very decorative and beautiful. And actually, I will show you how I do a gathering stitch on this machine, how I do gathers and nice little ruffles in things, because you don't need necessarily a special foot. This is a really great simple technique that you just take advantage of how long your stitches are going to be, and you can do beautiful kind of gathered designs for skirts. I always do it for an apron. I'll show you a little clip of an apron that I have. It's really cute. That's all gathered, and I just do it with this technique. So that is what you would use something like a 6 for. So hopefully by the end of this, that made a little bit more sense and it gives you something to work off of. There's no exact answer for what you should always be doing. There's always a little bit of wiggle room into those things. This is kind of like a foundation of what stitch lengths do and how they operate. So take and receive what you can from this. You know, think about what's decorative and what's, you know, a construction stitch. Make sure those stitches aren't too long when they need to be a little bit more secure, okay? Especially when you like open something, if you can see those threads, probably means it's a little bit too big, so it's time to tighten them down just a little bit. So hopefully that makes clear sense, but let me show you a really fun way that I do some nice kind of ruffles and gathering stitches on this machine without any special feet, just with a stitch length of 6. All right, so we're gonna start off obviously by setting our stitch length at 6, and then I'm gonna hold the tail of the top thread in my hand, and we're gonna bring the bobbin tail up as well. So we're gonna pop a needle down, needle up. That little crunch that you heard is totally normal when you put the feed dogs down, and then when you go to sew again, you're not gonna physically see them come up. You have to start sewing to pull them up. I'm using our little Timmi tweezers that we have on JukiJunkies.com. These are quite literally my favorite tweezers. They're so easy to use, and I can see my little bobbin thread help me pull that up with no problem. So what you're gonna do now is gonna make sure you have like a nice 5 to 6 inches of that bobbin and top thread over to the left side. And then you're gonna grab your project and you're gonna start by putting it right on the edge, like so. And you're just gonna sew really close to the edge, like, I don't know, 1/4 of an inch is good. You could even do less if you're able to. The key here now is to put your needle up and pull another 5 or 6 inches. You can already see it's kind of starting to naturally do it. And then trim it. So now it already kind of naturally started doing it because the stitch length of that length is going to start to shrink the fabric kind of in. It's already kind of sucking it in since it's not super tight. So what you can do at this point is you start to move things and grab things and pull it. So I'll separate these threads. It's kind of nice that the top and the bottom are different colors so I can see it. But I'll separate them and I'll start to pull one and I'll start to kind of just pull that gathering through. And if you pull the different threads at different times, if you pull them together, it actually doesn't give you that good of results. So I kind of like to pull them at one at a time. So I'll pull the bottom and then I'll pull the top. And then I'll spread out that gathering like this. And of course you can gather this as much or as little as you would like, but that's kind of the effect that you get there. I love doing this. I actually have a little purse that I do some gathering like this for, and I put it on my pockets, and it gives a really just fun, playful, kind of look to it. So cute. So you can add this to an apron. Obviously, if you're somebody who does apparel, this is a great way to achieve that too. It's very easy and you don't need to have anything extra necessary. You could even put your presser foot pressure up or a little bit more down to help you get more or less ruffles too. So for 2 layers like this, I could put my presser foot pressure more down on this project to help kind of gather and pucker that fabric a little bit more. But you saw how easy that was. It literally took me a couple minutes to do, and you can add this to any project in mind and just kind of give it a little fun flair. And just like that, I hope you learned a bunch about stitch lengths, what they mean, when to use them in different projects, and kind of take it and apply it to your own application of sewing. I feel like our first video at the Sewing Junkie Lab was a success, and I hope you guys liked. Make sure you like this video, comment, subscribe. We're posting new videos, and I have a whole list of videos for this new series, so I'm very excited. David has a coat coming as well, and Shannon's going to embroider our names on it, so just stay tuned. It's going to be pretty official around here in a little bit, okay? Make sure you guys comment down below if you have some suggestions about stitch lengths and things, or maybe something new that you learned, or something that you'd like to see in this series, because I have, like I said, tons of ideas, so I'm very, very excited. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure you stay tuned. We are posting new content every Sunday, so make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss out on those notifications and alerts. And if there's anything you want to try out here today, if you like that glide thread or those little Timmi tweezers that I use, make sure you head over to JukiJunkies.com so you can get yours, or just check it out in the description below and it'll take you to our website. See you next time. Bye.